Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Alba Aberdeen campaign group. Tonight we are joined by our very esteemed guest, Kenny MacAskill. Kenny, as you will know, is a former member of the Scottish Parliament from 1999 until 2016, a former Justice Secretary, and now one of our two Alba MPs in the Westminster Parliament. Tonight he's talking to us about law and order in Scotland, a subject which I know is an incredibly interesting one of all times, but particularly right now. So I'd like to hand over to Kenny MacAskill MP. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Lee. That's very kind of you. I mean, what I'll just say is my own personal thoughts. It's for Alba to decide what justice policy will be for the party, and I and Neil will accept that. I think, though, what I bring is 20 years' experience as a defence agent, then having had the opportunity as the shadow spokesman to prepare, because at that stage, I think Scotland was beginning to see the need for change. It was at a time of Tony Blair and indeed, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. It seemed to me that they were tough on crime, but forgot about being tough on the causes of crime. And actually, as a message, I think both are actually quite significant. Crime cannot be tolerated. It can be explained away, but keep our people safe and secure is the first duty of any government. So that was what I had the opportunity to do. In opposition, it was an opportunity to meet with people, to network round, to meet the brains, trust that I managed to, access into, whether Professor Andrew Coyle in terms of prison, Professor Bill White in terms of dealing with young offenders and children. And I think, we were actually quite successful. And I think that's, to some extent, the continued road that Alba should stick upon. I think the SNP has got blown asunder on some issues, but, hopefully they will continue the direction of travel. Because always remember, coming into office, and, I think it applies to justice and it applies across the board in Scotland. It's not how bad things are, but how much better things should be in Scotland. In terms of, criminal offending, if you take alcohol out of the equation, Scotland's actually quite a very law-abiding place. It's just alcohol-fueled crime that actually takes things over. In terms of other issues, such as violence, where we've got to address a culture of violence, I think we've made significant progress. So there are issues we have to address. I think we also have to ensure that there's no Scottish exceptionalism. I think probably I did sign up for some of that. I thought after 1999, all it was about ensuring we had the powers and we'd be able to address matters that was being held back. I think actually what we've seen over recent years is there's some issues that are entirely in our own control that we're failing to address, and we have to tackle them. I always remember the first day I came into office and had meetings with the civil service. They were asking what the priorities were for the new administration. And to some extent, I think the points I'll make, I think, are obviously the points I think Alba should make. First of all, we had an election pledge, as I was then in the SNP, to 1,000 additional officers. I don't think Alba needs to, seek 1,000 additional officers, but I think we're at a stage where you don't want to reduce officer numbers particularly greatly. Scotland's increased by population and by some 300,000, and the pressures upon police are significant. So maintaining a visible police presence actually deters crime as well as reassuring good citizens as much as it helps in actually dealing with crime. I think some progress was made in ensuring that we could maximise the benefit by going towards a single service, which was essential. But I think what we need to do is ensure a visible police presence in our communities. Because I also think we have to remember that the people and the communities that suffer most from crime are actually poor areas. I've always noted as an elected member that usually it's a disproportionate impact upon me in terms of lobbying I get from wealthier areas, but actually the areas that suffer most from crime are the poor areas, and they're the ones that we have to ensure that we protect, not necessarily those that are the loudest or have the access to power. I think we also have to have a coherent prison policy, and I think progress has been made there. There was never any reason why Scotland has a significantly higher prison population than, for example, our Celtic cousins. We haven't had the disruption and turmoil that they've had in the Northern Ireland, and yet we locked up significantly more than most other countries in Western Europe. It's just not right. We have made progress there. I think we have to recognise that, and I pay tribute to the government extending the presumption against a prison sentence from 6 months to a year. That's the right direction of travel. I can give you the reasoning why that's done. Basically, the prison service will tell you that they can contain somebody, but if you want them to work with somebody, then they've got to have some latitude. It takes some 8 weeks to actually book somebody into prison to work out if they've actually switched the gas off in the house have left behind. Have you got them out their job? What needs do they have? Do they have literacy skills or whatever else? And it takes them 8 weeks to actually prepare them to go back out. Have they got a home to go to, etc.? So that's you at 16 weeks. So if given that you get 50% remission, you're at 32 weeks. So unless somebody's in prison for more than 32 weeks, all they are doing is containing them, which they do well because people don't escape from Scottish prisons. But the idea that prison staff can work on them, do this fantastic, rehabilitation, and then tend them out reformed characters just can't be done. That's why, if they are to be able to do the job, and I think the prison service do a remarkable job in Scotland, they've got to have headroom, which means reducing prison numbers. They've got to have the time, which doesn't mean ramping up. It means actually punishing people in the community. And after all, community sentences are more effective in avoiding reoffending than a prison sentence, which actually brings a whole catalogue of problems with it. The third issue that I addressed to staff back then was alcohol abuse. And obviously with COVID, things have been slightly changed, but it remains a factor in Scotland. In prison, the biggest single issue in prison isn't alcohol or drugs. The biggest single issue is mental health. And that's a separate factor, those who are basically have issues there. But alcohol is an issue in criminal offending in Scotland. It always has been, and we have to, recognise if we want to reduce offending and especially violence, then we actually have to reduce alcohol. It's changed over the time. I remember going in to see a Chief Constable of Strathclyde who could show me a map that showed where every murder in Glasgow had taken place and where every in the past and where every murder in Glasgow was taking place at the present moment. And what you saw historically was stabbings, murders, serious assaults used to take place in or thereabouts to licensed premises. Now, licensed premises are very secure, very well looked after. The curse of home drinking, I have to confess, I have partaken it myself from time to time, but that's changed things. When you actually looked at where the serious assaults took place in Glasgow, it was no longer uptown. Uptown was actually remarkably safe. CCTVs, security staff, door staff, police on patrol. The incidents, serious assaults and murders took place in your flat or in your friend's flat or within 250 metres of your friend's flat. So alcohol remains an issue, and I think the government's got to do more than simply say we did minimum unit pricing. That was 8 years ago. There's more to be done, but alcohol remains a factor, and equally now, sadly, it's also fueled by alcohol being mixed in with drugs, which has a similar problem, if not even more so. Finally, we pointed out there was an issue with serious organised crime. That remains an issue in Scotland. I think we need to do an awful lot more on it. There's still, as with alcohol, as with violence, there's still a culture in some ways often put forward by the media. Serious organised crime are defined as, colourful West of Scotland businessmen, when actually the editors of the papers know that they're not colourful West of Scotland businessmen. They're gangsters who don't get their own fingers dirty, but who are, in charge of serious organised crime, and we shouldn't pander to them. They're not some nice, happy chappy, Al Capone. They're seriously bad people. And I think the problem in the West of Scotland is there's too many people too close to them. And I pay tribute to some former chief constables, in particular Steve House, who clamped down on that because even police officers sometimes fraternised. So those were the issues, and I think we made progress in each and every one of them, but they remain the major issues in Scotland. So we have to work towards that because they're the problem. I hope that, Keith Brown coming in will pick up on those issues. Equally, I think what he's got to do is drive forward, because there have been issues. We've made a great progress in addressing violence, but I remember speaking to the civil servants in charge of it, who had been concentrating on ACE Aware, which is, adverse childhood experiences, which I was saying that's really, really good. I admire that. We do have to recognise that people who have adverse childhood experiences do require, to be factored in. But at the end of the day, we also have to remember that we have to address it, we have to tackle it, sometimes we even have to punish it. And when I asked, well, what's the way of addressing ACEs as opposed to simply making us ACE aware, I got told that was the $1 million question. And until such time as we can work out how we're going to address it, I think you'll find difficulties in people who are saying Mr. MacAskill or Mr. Wilson or whatever else, whoever they're speaking to. You can tell me about being ace aware for that person. Can I tell you about my own background? Because it isn't, happy. And we've got to remember that actually those who are the victims of crime in Scotland, as I said at the outset, come from poor areas. And let's also remember that although crime disproportionately comes from people in poor areas, the overwhelming majority of poor people in Scotland would never dream of committing a crime, and it's our duty and obligation to protect them. So those are the things that we have to do. Things have moved on. The Offensive Behaviour in Football Act is no more. It was controversial at the time. I stand by it. There was an issue in football. It actually improved it. The statements made by some sheriffs about it being mince or whatever else were soon sorted out by the High Court. But it's gone now. I can't say that the issue has gone away, and indeed it seems to be worse now than ever. But there we are. I don't see the Parliament bringing it back. The Hate Crime Bill is now here. My first question on the Hate Crime Bill was why? People argued that the Offensive Behaviour Football Act was unnecessary. I thought it was necessary because there was a gap in the law, because singing these songs when all your friends round about you were singing it, you weren't disturbing the lieges, and therefore, you couldn't be charged with breach of the peace or whatever else. So that remains a problem. I tend to think it won't be as bad because, Lord Brackendale and others have looked at it. I think they've probably ameliorated it. But you do have to question, why was something like 2 years when we could be trying to work out, other issues in terms of offending, violence, alcohol was spent on that? We don't know what the law will have to be tested in court. I tend to think it won't be as bad, but we have to wait and see. Equally, as I say, my basic question is, it hasn't really advanced the law one bit, and yet it's consumed the Parliament for some 2 years. Self-ID is a significant problem that I raise with the unions south of the border. It's not so big a problem in Scotland, but it is still an issue. I spoke to the General Secretary of the Police Federation, who took the view that, yes, they'd had complaints about female officers having to search, people who are self-identifying. I think the position the police take is that there's always somebody wanting to prove themselves to the senior ranks, and you'll always get somebody to do it. The bigger problem is in prison, where there have been assaults by people who have gone into prison self-identifying as female, who were not female as we would normally describe them, and certainly not female sex, and that has caused an issue. That discussion is underway. It's partly ameliorated by the prison service at the moment, who have a policy of a risk assessment, but that could be blown asunder because there's currently cases in the High Court in England where people are pursuing it, and there's a debate going back and forward. Hopefully that won't be undermined. If it does, I think there's an issue there, and certainly, although the prison service in Scotland has not been particularly vociferous, it'd be fair to say that the unions south of the border have. So that's, as I say, what I inherited back then. The ground has changed, certainly in some aspects, but I think it remains exactly the same. I think in Scotland, actually, we are not the worst place in the world at all. We have things to do to improve. I always have to say that as Justice Secretary, I used to look south of the border and say, whatever problems I've got, it's not as bad as that, because, the difficulties in English prisons, the difficulties faced by the English police service are all significantly greater challenges than we have here. But we do have challenges, and we do have to improve. Some of it isn't just, the issues we face in terms of poverty, which is fundamental, and I'll come on to. Some of it is structural. I think that comes back to that point of view of Scottish exceptionalism. For a long time, I have felt that the position of the Lord Advocate is untenable. I always thought we should seek to move it. There was a limit to what could be done. I thought Alex Salmond did the right thing by ensuring that the Lord Advocate only came to Cabinet and sat in Cabinet on issues that were when they were giving advice on policy, and then they departed. But there's something fundamentally wrong. I think James Wolfe has crossed a line, and time will show, what was being done, what committees was he sitting on. And although he quite understandably says he recused himself from a criminal prosecution, at the end of the day, you're the Lord Advocate. You appoint people who work under you, who work to you. And I think the suggestion that it was entirely, devoid of any, it may have been devoid of any direct impact, but he certainly must have had, it must have transmitted itself in some ways because you remain the boss. That has to change. It can't be done quickly or easily because the Lord Advocate is enshrined in the 1998 Scotland Act. I think it has to be done a lot faster than the First Minister is currently suggesting that it should be looked at. There are knock-on effects in terms of how you have to change it, but it's not that hard to get to a situation that most other countries have, where you have an Attorney General who advises the government and who reflects the government view and answers for it on issues relating to the government's actions, lawful or otherwise, and you have a Director of Public Prosecutions, you can continue to call them the Lord Advocate, who pursues criminal matters. That is the position in most Western democracies. It's a position that should be in Scotland, and the sooner we get there, the better. I think there are issues with the Scottish Police Authority. I think it was the right thing when we established Police Scotland. We ensured that we didn't look at other models. For example, in Ireland, the Justice Secretary can direct the Garda Síochána. That is not the position in Scotland. The Justice Secretary has no powers to direct Police Scotland, rightly so. Equally, the Scottish Police Authority were established not simply to hire and fire the Chief Constable, as they've done with Phil Gormley, and to hold him to account as they seek to do in finances. They were also appointed to try and ensure that what might be called political issues could be dealt with because sometimes the police are not the best at the antennae. They're very good at policing and they're very good at being police officers. But in terms of the level, stop and search, impact on communities, that has to have antennae, which is why the Board of Police Authority is not simply those who have skills that we need in terms of finance and HR, but also people who are politicians from all political parties, but who are elected there not because it's Buggin's turn and somebody needs to get a few more, spondulics because they've got to pack out their lounges. They're there because they're people of quality and stature. I think the SPA has to step forward. The SPA was a bit too early in the day at the time of the furore over stop and searches. That's passed by. It could have been, I think, a bit more vocal, in protecting Steve House on armed response. I do note that even the First Minister, who once, privately was chastising me about Steve House's attitude, was out publicly praising Police Scotland for doing what Steve House was criticised for, which if you're an armed officer, you have to be able to, respond immediately. And we had that dreadful situation in Glasgow where people were stabbed. Sadly, some were killed. And the officers were able to jump out and fire, not as people were demanding several years back, especially William Rennie, that the guns should all be locked away and it would take you several minutes, if not more, to be able to access it. So Police Scotland should have, stepped up a bit more to the plate there. Not so much Police Scotland, but the Police Authority. Equally, I think now as we have a situation dealing with immigration, I think the Police Authority has to come into its being. The Police Scotland have to enforce all laws, not just laws that come from Holyrood. They have to enforce laws that come from Westminster. That's their duty. But the Police Authority has to try and broker protocols between the Police Scotland and the UK border force. That's something I think they've got to step into. They have to accept that the police have to enforce order. They cannot allow UK border force officers to be assaulted, to be driven away. Equally, I think they have to ensure that they probably say that this is how it has to be done. This, is where we'll support you. If you cross that line, we will not support you. That's their job, and that's what they have to step up to the plate for. In terms of the judiciary in Scotland, I actually think in some instances, certainly, some aspects of the Alex Salmond affair, I think they came out of it with some credit, not entirely, depending which judge you were dealing with. The issue remains, I think, as others have commented on, about the class structure in Scotland in the judiciary. It is your father was a judge and your father before him and his father before him, and on it goes. That's a wider social economic situation, but we do have to try and address it. It is getting better. The Judicial Appointments Board have made progress, but we've still got a fair bit to go. So that takes me on to ongoing issues, because I appreciate people will want to ask questions. I think in terms of police, we have to try and ensure that there is a visible police presence. I was listening on the radio today to roll out body cameras. That should be done. It was being discussed when I was there. The real reason is not simply to protect officers. The real reason is to quicken the court process. If you've got a video camera, if you can interview Mr. X at the time, then you don't actually have to give evidence. All you have to do is hear the sheriff say, play the tape, Mr. Fiscal, and you will play the tape of what actually happened, and you'll hear the evidence of the witness taken at the time, as opposed to the evidence trying to remember what it was they said or saw 18 months before. I think that will actually speed up justice, and that's somewhere we should be going. So I proceed in that direction. Prison is something. Some progress has been made. We've got the number of young offenders down. It's very hard for the prison service in Scotland because although we've got the numbers down, at one stage it was almost 1,000, now it's about 400 or 500. Equally, those who are in are much more challenged and challenging, and we actually have to spend more time with them. Equally, I always remember, and it remains the same situation, but when I was still in opposition, I remember meeting Roger Houchin, who had been the governor of Barlinnie. And his great claim to fame was he carried out a survey, and it was on some day in the early noughties. He got all his colleagues, he was governor of Barlinnie at the time, and he got every colleague who was a governor to record who was in prison that night and where did they come from. And that was before we moved to the multi-member wards that we have at the moment. At that stage, it was the old district council wards. And I remember the statistics roughly were that there were some 1,200 wards in Scotland, that there were the old district wards. They're obviously smaller than the current council wards. But what was staggering, and I don't believe that it will have changed, and I don't believe it would change on any other significant day, but 50% of Scotland's council wards had nobody in prison. Nobody had offended, nobody needed to go to prison. 25% of those prisoners came from something like 50 council wards. That's the old council wards, probably 3 of the wards that, for example, Lee currently represents in size. And you could almost name them. Something like 20 or so were from Glasgow. There was 13 from Edinburgh, 7 from Aberdeen, 5 from Dundee. There was one in Renfrewshire, and you thought that's Fergusley Park. There was one in Lanarkshire, that's Thrapple. The ones in Edinburgh I could name. They were then Craigmillar, Muirhouse, Pilton, Granton, Glasgow. It was the same. It was the housing schemes. 50% came from something like 100 council wards out of 1,200. So that doesn't mean that crime, people in those areas commit crime, because many people, the majority of people in those areas don't commit crime. But what it does show is those areas that are blighted by poverty and deprivation are the areas where criminality takes root. And that's why, as I say, for all, I've never been a fan of Tony Blair and Jack Straw, but the concept of being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime is right. You do have to deal significantly with violent disorder. If somebody robs an old woman of her savings, there is no sentence other than a prison sentence. What we have correctly done is stop sending people to prison for short periods of time. Sheriffs who thought it was good to send somebody away for 3 months or 6 months, that just makes matters worse. What keeps out of prison was the same in my day, or the same eternally. Have people got a place to go? Because too many people leaving prison have got no home to go to, or couch surfing. Have they got somebody who takes an interest in them, even if it's a granny, and if there's something to do? So with what to do there, and I think what we need to do is to ensure that only those who need to go to prison actually go into prison. That allows the prison service to work on them in terms of challenging violence and other issues. Others just have to be made to either repay by the sweat of their brow for drunken nonsense. Others just need, I used to say that interminably because it was a good soundbite for the media and the clips. Equally, I was well aware that many of the female offenders who weren't being, and correctly, not being put to prison, weren't being put out to, do hard work to pay back by the sweat of their brow. They physically weren't capable of doing it, but they were capable of being, monitored, supervised, and all those things. And we have to continue doing that. On alcohol, I think, we still have a problem. It's better than it was. Minimum unit pricing has made a significant difference. But there still is a culture of heavy drinking in Scotland, and I'm not going to chastise people for it. I've got more than enough sins against me for that. I've got the T-shirt from all over. Equally, there's always been a position in Scotland, of strong drink is taken and trouble can follow. I had some strong drink after a big long walk yesterday. Thankfully no trouble followed. I do think there's things we have to do. COVID is resulting in pubs closing, and I have to say I've always tried to support the Licensed Trade Association because I think alcohol is a product that largely should be consumed as a social matter with friends and preferably in a supervised area rather than drinking, with your drinking buddies in a flat. I think what we have to do is start looking at things like separate tilling. I always remember John Carnahan, who was the architect of the Violence Reduction Unit, making a point that stuck with me ever since. He says, look, cab sec, he said, if I want a tin of beans, I go to a green, Sir Trevor, if I want to get a haircut, I go to a barber's. If I want to get shoes, I go to a shoe shop. Why, if I want to get alcohol, can I go to just about any shop? And there was a stage when even within Holyrood, from my Westminster, not my Holyrood office, there was something like 40 outlets selling alcohol within 10 minutes walk. They weren't pubs. They were, a lot of the wee corner shops are now going because they've been replaced by the supermarkets. Tesco sells something like 50% of alcohol in Scotland. I just think we should actually tighten up a bit on that. By all means, buy alcohol, but let's make it, a bit more expensive in the on-trade off-trade rather, to support the on-trade, and let's make it that it's something you don't do just because you're coming down the aisle and the last aisle's always the alcohol aisle. If you want to buy alcohol, a bit like fags, go and buy it, but make sure it's what you want to do. Equally, drugs have supplanted in some ways, and I'll come on to that. Serious organised crime remains a problem. There is an issue. I never got to the bottom of it before I was going out the door. We'd always been going to burn at the professionals, if I can put it that way, because serious organised criminals don't act in a vacuum. When people who ostensibly have no income but own something like 40 flats in Kilmarnock, you ask questions. How are they buying flats? We have brought in, quite correctly, checks that you have to do. Sometimes can be a real nuisance when you're setting up Alba Party branches and you have to go through all this ID. I'm to blame for that. My apologies. Equally, we have people who are buying properties and they must know that the people who they're acting for are, who they are and whatever. And yet I'm still to see the lawyers and accountants and others being prosecuted. I don't know why that's not happening. It's about time it does, because if we really want to tackle serious organised crime, it's not street dealers we need to hit hard. It's those who are actually making the money, and those who are making the money off those who are really coining it in. So as I say, I think serious organised crime is something that still continues to need to be tackled. It's not something benign. It is, the people who are operating the serious organised crime are not living in Castlemilk or Pilton or Muirhouse or, Northfield or any rundown area in Aberdeen. They're living in big fancy houses that we can't afford. And it's about time that we stopped A, venerating, how much we drink in Scotland, B, how tough and macho we are, and C, these colourful West of Scotland, but they're not all West of Scotland businessmen. That's something that I despair of in the Scottish press. Equally, that's just another sin that goes with their political biases. But, that has to change. There's so many things to be proud of in Scotland. It's not how much we can drink or whatever else, and we've got to move on from that, and that's something that we have to do. I think we do have to address drugs. Drugs are now a growing problem. It's still alcohol that actually causes the offending. You speak to young offenders, it's always alcohol more than drugs. Drugs might be what they're caught for, but in terms of violence, it's alcohol that's the perpetrator, but sadly the two are going hand in hand. It's for Alba to decide what policy they want. I have to say, I came round after, for a long time, and certainly as Justice Secretary, to the view that, the war on drugs is lost. It's a misnomer anyway, because, you're fighting your own families or whatever else. We should decriminalise. We should follow the Portuguese model. We should treat it as a health problem. That doesn't mean, that I condone taking drugs. I've never been one of these people who thinks it's just a lifestyle choice. I tend to think those taking it are rather sad, vulnerable individuals, but they need support. What they don't need is locked up. I think, to be fair to Angela Constance, she's going to try and do better than what was going on before. But until you decriminalise, until you stop waging war, you won't have the money and the resource. And therefore, the Portuguese model, will that result in Scotland having no drug problem? No. There'll always be people who will take drugs, who will suffer from addiction because of, issues they face or whatever else. But it will reduce the criminality, and that's where I came from. Because I remember when I first became Justice Secretary, a drug debt was paid if there was a debate over it by stabbing in the buttocks. Then it became the production of a firearm. Now it's the firing of a firearm. The level of violence is increasing. Even since I've been out of office, we have seen people gunned down in the street in Glasgow and indeed elsewhere. This is only going to get worse because there's so much money in drugs. And until we take the money out of it, and as for cannabis, frankly, I've always been, comfortable. I don't take it myself. I never have. But I look at Ontario, I remember meeting the State Liquor Board in Ontario, and if only we hadn't given up the right to Tesco's, never mind everyone else, they were making something like £4 billion per year, Canadian dollars, in terms of, profits from alcohol sales. They're going to be making at least that by taxing and spend on cannabis. As with alcohol, you can regulate what it is they're taking, so you stop skunk and high, volume stuff, just like regulated alcohol. Minimum unit price allows you to hit low cost, high strength alcohol and encourage people and incentivize brewers to actually reduce alcoholic strength. That's something the Chancellor should do more of, because, even within my lifetime, the strength of alcohol drink has gone from something like 3.5% ABV in terms of beer up to about 5% ABV. It should be incentivized to get down. The same's happened with wine. But drugs, I just think we should, we have to have control over it. And that's part of the devolved issues. We're going to fight on both. It's absurd to be the Scottish Justice Secretary and then to say that you're in charge of justice in its entirety. Because if you want to tackle serious organised crime, then you can't tackle serious organised crime without addressing drugs and firearms. What's reserved to Westminster? Drugs and firearms. So you're tackling one hand behind your back, but it affects even smaller aspects. There are steps I think we should go further in terms of, it was even in terms of fireworks, but then fireworks can also be classified and are classified as a firearm because they claim that, they obviously have dynamite and other factors in it. Drink driving is something where I think we could be reducing the drink driving limit lower. But to reduce the drink driving limit lower, you've got to be able to vary the penalty. I think many people would actually accept a lower limit, but they wouldn't accept a year's ban for an even lower limit. But they might accept, a yellow card for first offence. They might accept a fine. They might accept a very limited ban. But we don't have those powers, and without those being devolved. So there's work to be done. There's work to be done on the structures. There's work to be done on policy. But fundamentally, in terms of where Scotland and criminal justice in particular, I actually think we're not too bad. We're not bad people. We lock up too many people. We've got to reduce, the violence that follows from alcohol. We've got to change the culture of violence. I doff my hat to the Violence Reduction Unit. That has been wonderful, but we've got to keep at it. And fundamentally, we've got to address inequality, because I always remember back in 2008, police warning, or some officers, not all, warning that crime would rise because of, growing poverty. Actually, crime didn't rise and it hasn't risen. But what does fuel crime is inequality as opposed to poverty. People, who are poor don't necessarily commit crime, but people who face inequality, who never have the opportunity to, obtain the benefits that, those of us who are materially better off, then they'll seek to get it because they'll say, well, why do I have a life of penury or whatever else? So inequality will fuel crime. And I also think that, the consequences from coronavirus are also going to make it very challenging for police, which is why I think, we have to get our cards in place to make sure that we continue with a police service that we're proud of, that they have the resources to deal with it. But then when we're dealing with people, we deal with people in a way that we don't continue the problem or make the problem worse, that we actually try to check it, we work with them, we punish them if we have to in the community where they can atone for it and we can be improved by it as a community, rather than simply locking people up and achieving absolutely nothing. So that's my tuppence worth. Some things worked when I was in office, some things didn't, but equally, I tend to think the statistics showed that we were heading in the right direction. We've continued to go there. None of them were my policies. A lot of them were the policies of the likes of Professor Coyle, who I still go to for advice, Professor White, who's the architect of the whole systems approach and who is now an Alba Party member, but should be given great credit because he's the one that turned around that actually, rather than dealing with children as offenders, what we should do is try to work out why is a child committing a criminal offence, because invariably behind every child who's troubled, you'll find a troubled family. And, God bless Bill for managing to make sure that we changed all that and moved away from where we had previously been with Borstal's, young offenders institutes and all that. They didn't work. But there we go. We'll never have a Valhalla. There will always be crime. It's going to be with us, but we don't need to have the extent of it. And equally, we can improve it by making our country a fairer, more tolerant way. Because the final thing is, anybody who suggests that what we have to do is just get tougher on crime, look at the United States. They tool up, ramp up, they treat people horrifically, and crime goes through the roof. The worse you make it, the worse you treat people, the worse it'll be for all of us. We've got to act toughly when we have to, but we act with humanity all along. So that's my tuppence worth. I'm open to criticism, points of view, you name it. There we go.
Thank you, Kenny, for a fascinating debate there on law and order in Scotland. And thank you for praising the law-abiding residents of my ward in the Mearns. Greatly appreciated. We will open to general debate now, but I'll maybe kick off with a couple of things. The first thing I want to ask, and I realise we could probably have a whole evening on this itself, but there's a movement now from a number of politicians towards ending corroboration. And from my own perspective is I'm quite sceptical about it. I just wondered what your take on it was. And secondly, since you left office, none of your successors, like you, has had a background in law. Do you think we lose direction in terms of justice policy when we have ministers who are not legally trained? Thank you.
I think two things. First of all, no. Do you have to be a lawyer to be Justice Secretary? No, I don't think you do. I don't think it should ever be obligatory. I think some roles like Attorney General or Advocate you have to be. Equally, though, I also have to say that I benefited from not being the Justice Secretary and not even being the shadow Justice spokesman, having been a lawyer for 20 years. I actually thought that had I not had that, I would still have thought as like a defence agent, and actually it did me some good to have a wee bit of time out. I've got a great deal of respect for the Scottish Bar and Scottish criminal defence lawyers. Equally, I also know the tricks because I participated in them. So it helps in terms of nomenclature, but I don't think it should ever be a requirement. I think it's like any portfolio. If you go out, network, learn your brief, then it doesn't matter if you've got a law degree or a law training, but you've got to know your brief. And that applies to government ministers in Scotland and government ministers south of the border. Sadly, some people who aren't qualified in whatever it is, science, law, you name it, never get to the grip of it, where others, might not be expected to have any knowledge, go out and do remarkably well because they actually network and learn. And I have to say, I was going back to what I was saying there. I didn't, any of the policies I brought in 2007, they didn't come from me. They came from Roger Houchen. They came from Bill White. They came from, Andrew Coyle. All of these things, they didn't actually even come from civil servants, because I always remember being a frightened young minister in office asking Andrew, as we were rolling back the privatisation of what is now HM Prison Low Morth, Bishop Briggs Prison as it was then. Am I doing the right thing? Because the pressure from the senior civil servants that it had to be a private prison, and indeed the lies I got told that, Minister, it's cheaper, when it's absolute bollocks, so the only thing is you have to be aware of your brief, and I think the Scottish government's got to network a bit more. We networked when we were in opposition. I don't think they're networking as much as they should do. On corroboration, I have to say I think corroboration has to go. No country developed world has corroboration. If it was so good and such a doyen of the Scottish judicial system, countries would be knocking their door down to come to Scotland to say, can we learn all about corroboration? But they look at it and they think, nuts. I mean, I was a defence agent and I know how you operate. You operate and how can you get out of this? And equally, it also drives the Fiscal's office. Is everything corroborated? Can we do this? It creates injustice. You do have to have, checks and balances. And Lord Bonamy was paid £100,000, as I remember. I was staggered by having to pay that, especially given he was on a judicial pension. But we paid £100,000 for him to come in with, the safeguards that go with it. Corroboration should go. It has been kicked into the long grass by the current First Minister, as soon as I was out of office. It does create injustice because, women and children who suffer offences in private rarely get justice, and the current statistics bear that out. Does it mean that anybody can come and say, I accuse you, Lee Wilson, of this? No, it doesn't, because what it does mean is you have to have the best evidence. You look at the totality of the evidence as opposed to look at, is everything corroborated? So I think, we already have things in place. All we have to do is actually implement Lord Bonamy's safeguards, because there were issues that fell, to be considered, and I take the blame for moving perhaps too quickly on that. But, in terms of, the effect upon the jury, I think, you actually have to change some things there. But no, I think corroboration has to go. You have to have safeguards, but bring in the safeguards and we'll take it from there. But I'll just, to finish on that, since you asked me, Lee, the biggest issue I ever got in corroboration is define it. Because I remember having the two foremost Scottish legal professors in criminal law, and I said, can you give me a definition of corroboration on one page or even two-side A4? And the answer was not that we can agree upon. So the position is that even the learned academics can't tell you just what it precisely is. The judiciary can't tell you why we have it. And it certainly is an impediment to justice. We have to make sure that we have safeguards, but I think the safeguards are there with what Lord Bonamy brought in.
Thank you, Kenny. We've got a question for you from Gavin. Is it still the case that police and fire and rescue lost their VAT exemption with the formation of the single force? If so, how has this been allowed to slip down the agenda?
I think it's now been resolved, but it was a political thing. We knew that if we moved to a single service, then there was the risk that VAT would go. But the savings that would be made were greater than the VAT by a significant factor. What we did know was that Police Service Northern Ireland didn't pay VAT. We also knew that there were other organisations, such as environmental bodies south of the border. And I remember going to initially it went through my office, then it went through John Swinney's office. And we said to Treasury, what do we need to do to be able to, ensure that Police Scotland and Fire and Rescue Service Scotland get VAT? And they said, we're not telling you. So we said, what about this? And they went, no. And we said, what about that? And they went, no. It was a political decision to refuse to grant, VAT exemption. Anything that we put forward was knocked back. It's since been granted, as I understand, but it was a political decision that was just, lamentable on their parts. The Northern Irish scenario wasn't exactly the same because of the structure, but we said, what do we need to do to structure to be able to get it? And they just said, we're not telling you. So that tells you where they were coming from.
Thank you, Kenny. From Joan. Hi, Kenny. What is your view on non-jury trials?
I have to say, I think, senior serious matters where you're going to prison should be by a jury. The only issue I ever had, and I still stand by it, and they do it south of the border, is some serious organised crime trials take place south of the border out with, and indeed some highly complicated frauds take place out with juries. And I remember asking one of the Lord Advocates, would you like this? And they actually didn't want it. They thought that defence agents would use it as a rule. I just took the view that some things you might have heard of things, MTech fraud, it's deeply, deeply complicated. Some of these frauds that come in, if you're a jury member, then I feel really, really sorry for you. One, it's going to run for weeks and most people will lose the will to live. And two, it's even difficult for the judiciary to follow it. So my take, Joan, is I actually think jury trials are important. Except I think there may be an argument in some instances with serious frauds that's very, very technical, where you have to have you're having accountants where you're actually having to have, accountants providing some evidence. I think some of those I would look, especially going back to what I was saying, I think we need to ramp up on serious organised crime. Let's stop picking up laddies who are just breaking into Ladbrokes, and let's start these people, because recorded crime is down. But that's because so much has gone online. And I have to say, I wouldn't fancy being a jury member in some online crime, because it will be hard enough to follow. I struggle getting onto a Zoom chat, trying to work out, some serious criminality. So that's the only caveat I had. I'm not going to die in a ditch over it. And to be fair, Frank McConnell didn't want it. There are some instances where I think, corruption, I do know that there's been some trials where we think juries were subverted in Scotland just because of threats or whatever else. And so other than some very, very minor exceptional cases, I think the jury should stand for the serious offences. But some, I can now I can't when I'm an MP once I stand down, I have to say, my heart would sink if I ever got landed with being a juror on a serious fraud trial. I think you'd lose the will to live, never mind struggling to understand
it. Indeed. I see Teresa is writing something, but if you want to actually come off mute, Teresa, and I can let you in rather than typing.
Oh, so sorry there. I'd actually written, I see I've sent it to you, Lee, by mistake. It said, what are Kenny's views on the chalk and sticker incidents as seen in the news? For example, the Women Vote Please stickers, and about the police's role in this. Are such stickers against the law and a criminal matter?
Well, I think in my view, no. I mean, I can't understand what Police Scotland is playing at. I think this is, again, something that the Scottish Police Authority should be, overseeing. I did see, and I've only seen the Twitter feed relating to Marion Miller. I found that deeply concerning. I think, I don't know whether it's true or not, but if it is true, I would hope some action would be taken against the individual officer who seems to be overstepping her mark. Police Scotland do have to, police service is not perfect. I actually think, though, in police service in Scotland is outstanding. There are issues. Individuals fall from grace. Politicians fall from grace, police fall from grace, police officers fall from grace. But in the main, I think the police service in Scotland is remarkably good. We've also got to remember there are many countries in the world, and I've travelled extensively. I wouldn't ask a police officer at the time, never mind asking them for directions or even recommendations about where to go for my tea. And yet people routinely do that in Scotland. And I think that shows that you've got a police service that, I'm not going to suggest that police officers come from, Drumchapel or places like that. Not really anymore. There's the odd laddie comes through, but it's not. But they still tend to know the communities that they come from. They tend to live near the communities that they police in. So I think, and it also remains a police service. Occasionally it has to use force, but largely it does so unarmed. I think that, what we have to do is to continue to get that police service. I'm very worried about the increasing drive towards, officers who have degrees. I think there should be officers who have degrees. I know lots of very, very clever officers. Equally, some of the best police officers I met, only had a couple of hires. I never saw them run the length of themselves in their life, but they were remarkably good police officers in places like Craig Miller. They knew the people, they engaged with the people, the people respected them and they respected the people. So I think something, starting with some of this political correctness culture, I don't know where Police Scotland have, why that was tweeted out by Kirkcaldy Police, I find just gobsmacking. There's worse things go up on chalk. To see it as a criminal offence is just incredible. To have police resources, I don't know where that's coming. I would hope that Police Scotland would reflect, and I would hope that the Scottish Police Authority would be getting a grip. It comes back to the points I'm making. I've got a Zoom call on Friday with Human Rights Watch, because Police Scotland, I have to say, I didn't know, have been training the police in Sri Lanka, not for a while, I think during COVID, but they had been in Sri Lanka. The police service in Sri Lanka has not got a good name for human rights, and we shouldn't be engaged with it. I have to say, when I was round the police college, where I often was, I'd heard about the good work we were doing in Gaza, which I supported. I didn't know that actually we're also involved in places like Sri Lanka. And again, that's something I think the Scottish Police Authority's got to step up to the mark. We should not be doing that. just if it's a nice earner for Police Scotland, I think you have to tell them, no, you're not on. We'll just take it on the chin. We're not doing that. So I think the police authority has to sort this out. Somebody, because it seems to me that the tweet is just insane. The chalk things are just, frankly, we have other things that police officers should be doing, and it's certainly not that.
Thank you, Kenny. I think if we're criminalising chalking on pavements, quite a few of us could be behind bars before long.
Absolutely.
Dawn says, "Hi, Kenny. Is there any chance the hate crime bill could be repealed in the future, considering the recent case Marion Miller is going through?"
Well, that'd be a matter for the Scottish Parliament. So I think given the current constitution or makeup of the Scottish Parliament with SNP and Greens, I think the short answer is probably sadly no. I think the best we can probably hope for the hate crime bill is it just begins to get to lying in what they call desuetude, that it doesn't get used very much at all. Because to some extent, if somebody's out there propagating hate, you're always going to prosecute them before. It wasn't on. Where we have had issues, and I think, I'm glad that the police are, ramping up on what happened in George Strait with Rangers. But equally, I have to say, I think they set the bar so low 2 months ago when they first won the league and they got, an escorted march into George Square and nothing happened. They set the bar at such a low level that people thought they could probably get away with it. So I think, in terms of hate crime, I think we should be pursuing, A, the misogyny that goes with domestic violence, B, the anti-Catholicism, and indeed the racism that we also sadly see in far too many areas of Scotland. That's the real issues. But hate crime bill, until you get Keith Brown or the Parliament prepared to overrule it, they're stuck with it. Equally, I think that I would trust the High Court to, I think, try and further amend it. Because to be fair, Lord Brackendale, who looked at it, it's actually quite a clever guy. So I think some of the worst edges have been taken off it. My real question is, why? What was the point?
I entirely agree, Kenny. I'm going to come to Hamish because I see you've got your video on. Maybe that's because you want us to all see you, but do you have a comment? You're on mute. You're on mute, Hamish. Okay, you maybe can't hear me. If anybody wants to ask anything, please raise your hand and I can come to you.
Sorry, Lee, I've got a question. I muted my microphone. Can I just go ahead and ask it?
Yes, fire away, Hamish.
Okay, Kenny. It's not. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek question, but one of the things we hear Scottish Government ministers say repeatedly over some things, well, we can't actually do anything like this because it's a reserved matter, and sometimes that's largely true, sometimes it's partly true, sometimes it's maybe just an excuse. Was there ever a time when you were presented with that argument, you thought to yourself, oh, stuff it, let's just go for it anyway and see what happens?
You can't really do that. Unfortunately, your law officers would just say you can't do that and it would be struck down by court. I mean, there were issues, and obviously we built up, political steam to be, first of all, air weapons, where at the end of the day, Westminster just went, do what you want. And secondly, on drink driving, reducing the limit. So we got political power there. I have to say, I more often found that Westminster didn't really care what happened up here. By that, I mean the civil servants. You would write to them to say this was reserved and we're proposing to do this. And actually they would say, quite often it tended to be, oh, we didn't know it was reserved at all. Just do what you want, Jock, sort of thing. I mean, it's the politicians who interfere, the Westminster civil servants, because, for example, proceeds of crime is very complicated because the Misuse of Drugs Act is reserved to Westminster, and most proceeds of crime usually have something to do with drugs, because that's where the money is, as I was saying earlier. And frequently you'd be wanting to do, because we want very good proceeds of crime legislation, and I think the officials dealing with it were remarkably good, but they would have to go to Westminster to say this is reserved and we want to do it. And frequently the response was, oh, well, we didn't know that, but if that's what you want to do, on you go. it's the politicians who step in. When I've, asked, will you devolve powers, so we can reduce the drink driving limit further? No. And you feel like saying, why not? Will you give us the powers? Because we can't, we've had the power to license air weapons, but we can't set, store on ammunition or other such. That has to be dealt with by Westminster. So it's a political issue. The civil servants in the Ministry of Justice, in my view, and other departments, they really didn't care. They didn't know.
Can I just come back to you on that? With something. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Peter Crycan, I think it is, has this mobile day use drug centre that goes that I understand is technically illegal. How did we get to that point, or is it technically legal?
Well, according to the Lord Advocate, he thinks it's illegal. You have others who have taken the view that actually, you can, because there are, at the end of the day, in Scotland, something has to be A, against the law, B, capable of being, prosecuted, and C, in the public interest to prosecute. I think many could take the view that the Lord Advocate could simply have turned a blind eye and allowed it to go. But the current Lord Advocate took a very strict view and said, no, you can't do that. And therefore, to get, drug consumption rooms, then you're going to actually have to formally, have powers devolved, or either as part of the Misuse of Drugs Act in whole or in part. Equally, I have to say, I think it suited the current Scottish government to go nowhere near drugs because they just don't want to touch it, which is why they haven't even been pushing on medicinal cannabis, which they should. So the Lord Advocate took the view, you can't have them, it's illegal. Equally, I think police officers just didn't bother. People who were going to the van, some people I think have been spoken to, others haven't. But that's always been policing. It's like, I've always been supportive of. I remember having arguments with SNP colleagues in Edinburgh because I think people drinking in public parks can actually be quite intimidatory. And equally, I would get people in Edinburgh saying, "Oh, but people won't have a bottle of wine in Princess Street Gardens." No, it's the kids having a huge big carry and a bottle of Buckfast. Just stop allowing that. And equally, you speak to the police. If an innocent, tourist bought a bottle of wine, police officer's not going to say, "You're huggled, sir." Police officer's going to say, "Actually, sir, you're not supposed to have that here. I'm going to go to the end of the park, and you can either finish it up, put it away, or thank you, and don't do it again." That's all. So it's about police discretion. So I just think the Lord Advocate he still is a Lord Advocate, is a very bright man. No political savvy. I'm pretty certain previous Lord Advocates would simply have said, don't go above the score, and we'll not do anything about it.
Good. Yeah, thanks.
It's a very good comment there. We have a comment here from Jimmy, a retired police officer. The hate crime bill as it stands is unenforceable and appears to qualify hate by political choice, not by its impact on victims. From that, I would maybe like to ask you, Kenny, your view about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And I want to focus particularly on journalism here. I know you were commenting quite recently on the Craig Murray sentencing, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, I mean, obviously, freedom of speech. I remember going through the arguments at the time of offensive behaviour at football. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you cannot be offended. People have to be, capable of, saying things that some of us might be offended by, but isn't necessarily a hate crime. I think there's probably a lot of point because about the hate crime bill and just how do you enforce it. I think, from discussions with the General Secretary of the Police Federation, they are of the view, what is it? I think we're going to have real problems in the enforcement of some of the fixed penalties in coronavirus. Hate crime bill is just, I think officers probably take the view, what is it we're to do? We're not quite sure what this constitutes. So I just think, they've just opened Pandora's box. Hopefully common sense will result in the police authority and Police Scotland's directions, unless somebody's bang out of order, It's a very amusing story. You police officers sometimes gild a lily or even lie. If someone's bang out of order, then you should prosecute it. Because I always remember I wasn't in the trial, but I was the next trial due on, and I remember there's these Aberdeen football casuals, as they were called, who were charged with a disorder at Dundee Station, where the police officer was saying, they shouted, "Die, you Jew bastards," to which the defence was, "No, we didn't say that. What we said was, die, you Jute bastards." And I have to say, knowing Dundee and Aberdeen, it seemed to me that the defence was actually quite. How any police officer would say, Dundee is not noted for its Jewish community, or indeed Aberdeen for its anti-Semitism, but the badinage, if I can put it that way, with the bad language I apologise for using, and especially relating to Jute, is something I had heard over many a year. So, some of these things, is that a hate crime? Well, I think they were out of order and should be done with a breach of the peace. But, anybody coming in and saying, whether it's Jew or Jute, well, I think Jew, I would, yes, just begin to say it's anti-Semitic, personifying there, but Jute, no. So I think these things just, there are people who are, we know where the victims of crime are. It's A, women, B, religious, firstly, in terms of race, with, Pakistanis and folk of Asian origin, and then it's, Catholicism, which, anti-Catholicism, having been reading a lot of even historic Scottish literature, anti-Catholicism ran deep in Scottish society, not in terms of hatred, but in terms of, prejudice. And, we have to address that.
Your comment on Jute in Dundee was very interesting there. I've recently finished your book, Radical Scotland, and the radical nature of the Weavers.
Absolutely.
I don't see any further comments. If anybody wants to come in at this stage, then feel free to shout if you'd like to come in with any further comments. If not, then I would like to thank you, Kenny, for your fascinating contribution today. I think it's been a wonderful meeting, and we've made history by having the inaugural Aberdeen Alba meeting. We hope to have many more, and Kenny offline has kindly agreed to come back at a later date to hopefully talk about one of his books on Jimmy Reid, which I'm sure we'd all be most interested in hearing. So thank you very much, Kenny. I would ask the Aberdeen members to stay on a little bit after we finish streaming to talk about office bearers and some business. But for the rest of you, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us tonight.